When COVID-19 went global, the world as we know it indelibly changed. Quarantines and lockdowns clamped down people's lives. Global supply chains and the economy were disrupted. And it was a severe test for national and international governance. So how else could people's lives change, for better or for worse? And how could the world look in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by satellite by John Ross, a senior fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, by Tong Dong, professor of philosophy at Fudan University, and Anar Tungan, our independent current affairs commentator. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So let me start with you, Anar. People say that the epidemic is reshaping people's lives because of the changes in almost everything. Has your life been changed?
Well, yes, my life has been changed. I mean, obviously, I've survived in Beijing for the last 3 months. There were restrictions on it. But in the end, I mean, hope springs eternal. Like the Beijing spring, things reflower and they go on. The question is, how does the rest of the world cope with what they have in front of them? And that's, to me, is the number one question. You cannot start talking about the changes in the world until you know how long this virus is going to continue before it's contained.
And John, of course, we know that the United Kingdom is still in the midst of it, but how has your life been affected by COVID-19?
Well, I think like more or less everybody else, I'm not able to go out. There's a serious situation with my friends. People who I know have been infected, and because I study the statistics on this very carefully, I know that the situation is at the present time in the UK is out of control. Apart from the United States, this is the most rapid increase in coronavirus cases in the entire world. It's not yet the greatest in absolute numbers, but the rate of increase is very, very, very high. So obviously it's a disturbing experience.
Professor Bai, what has COVID-19 made your life different than before?
Yeah, actually, in a way, with all the international conferences canceled, I have more time for myself to do some writing and reading. And also, I think, this challenge poses theoretical issues that are precisely my field of study. What would be an ideal political order for China and for the rest of the world?
Let's talk about order, because many politicians, scholars, economists, and entrepreneurs are wondering how the world will look like after the coronavirus. What do you think will be the major changes in the world after this, Professor Bai?
I'm a political philosopher by training, so I'm not very good with reality. So what I'm concerned with what the world should be like, and so what kind of government can respond to the COVID-19 pandemic like this, and what kind of international order should we have to respond to future threat like this more effectively.
And actually, in a recent article entitled "The Coronavirus Pandemic Will Forever Alter the World Order," Dr. Harry Kissinger said, "While the nations cohere and flourish on the belief that their institutions can foresee calamity, arrest its impact, and restore stability. When the COVID-19 is over, many countries' institutions will be perceived as having failed." So, John, obviously, we didn't see it coming, and we're still bearing the impact, and we don't know what kind of social order will come out of this, but what will be the social and world order be like?
It's impossible to tell at the present time. It depends what happens in the United States. The development of the virus in the United States is the most serious in the entire world, both from the point of view of the speed of increase and now from the total number of cases. In the US, the total number of deaths, for example, is now almost 3 times that of China. But the population of the United States is only 1/4 that of China. This means that the actual situation in the United States is 12 times as bad as the situation in China, and it's getting worse. The United States has made a series of tremendous errors in this, not taking it seriously, not having a lockdown. It's going to have the 3rd mass death experience on US soil in its entire history. Only the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, 1919 and the Civil War are comparable. Unless it responds very, very rapidly, it is going to have a complete catastrophe. It's already a disaster, and the only question is whether it becomes a catastrophe. So we will have to see what happens in the next weeks, because this is going, in the US, this is going to have a very profound effect on the world. Until all that's known, I don't think you can give a definitive answer.
NR, what about your country's performance? Of course, the US is still the #1 economy. It has the most advanced healthcare system, but when it can take control, and can it weather through the storm?
Well, when you say the most advanced, remember that 10% of our population, including illegals, are not covered by this advanced medical system. So right now you're dealing with, and I would agree with John on this, it is something that is verging on a catastrophe. You have a leadership issue which is clearly not able to put out a single message. It is not able to put out a single strategy. You know, everybody is pretty aware now that this idea of a patchwork approach to COVID-19 does not work. So right now, I would say that the U.S. is actually failing. It would get an absolute F on its efforts. It's trying to be half pregnant. It's talking about the economic repercussions, but it's not understanding that you cannot measure those until you have a handle on the health issues.
But a lot of people are hoping that the resilience of the American system can correct itself and may bounce back soon.
Well, you know, but you have to remember, I mean, the United States, we have a tremendous amount of resources and natural and wealth. But the problem is that we are 4% of the world's population, but we consume almost 23% of the world's GDP. Any tinkering with that, internally and externally, has massive effects on the rest of the world. And at this point, we have a leadership who seems unconcerned about what the repercussions are for everybody else. It's all about who gets reelected.
And it also has its impact, this COVID-19, on international relations. John, from a global perspective, countries are now shutting themselves off from each other by enacting travel restrictions and also trade restrictions as well. Could measures like these stoke ultranationalism in different areas and turning back the clock of globalization in a dramatic way?
Depends how quickly the medical situation can be got control of. I mean, in the economy, you normally measure the short term in terms of weeks or months. But in the medical situation, the short term is days and then sometimes hours. And you can't tell yet how. We know it's going to be very severe. This is going to be the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. That's already certain and already determined. The question is, how long will it continue to go on for? Unless very, very stringent measures are taken in the United States and Europe, which is but now by far the worst situation in the world. The US is the worst and Europe is quite close afterwards. You are going to have something which will have enormously long-term consequences. What I hope for is that the shock of this disaster is so great that it will reverse the situation. There seems to be some understanding of that in parts of Europe. Italy is beginning to take serious measures at last. Spain is beginning to take serious measures. The US is not yet taking serious measures. One hopes that the pressure of public opinion and to be quite honest, fear will lead to changes in government policy, but it has to come very quickly. That means within days or absolutely weeks at the very most.
And do you think the governments in Europe and North America have come to terms with the new realities and will adjust their policies?
Was that to me? Yeah, no, they haven't understood it. You're still having talk in Europe about lifting the restrictions soon and the peak occurred in 2 weeks, etc. The only reason that the peak occurred very quickly in China was because China took very rigorous lockdown measures. It's true. From the first lockdown in Wuhan on 23rd of January up to the peak of cases, which was on the 4th of February, was only 13 days. But that was because China took very, very strict measures. But no country in Europe, or let alone the United States, has taken measures equal to China's. Therefore, there's no reason why the lockdown should be able to be liftable in the same type of period as China's.
Yes, this is a public health issue, but it also has its toll on big power relationship. China and the U.S. must cooperate against the coronavirus. Well, this is the latest article on the New York Times by Cui Tiankai, that's the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. And here we quote, "China is doing whatever it can to support the United States and other countries in need." But the problem is, it seems there are some ungrateful responses from both Europe and America, and saying China is actually practicing mass diplomacy, is trying to win favors with this soft power. What do you think? John?
I think that it's nothing. It's China's trying to get people alive, and I think that will be the reaction of people. Somebody once said to me, you know, what about human rights? I said the chief human right that China has established at the moment is the right to stay alive, and that's what's been established in China with a very successful response to the coronavirus. And I think that people will be pleased to get I know they will be. I'm pleased to see some people openly acknowledging this, even in the United States. The governor of Massachusetts, for example, sent a plane to Shanghai, actually using the new Patriots NFL team's plane to get them, and openly thanked China. Other people are doing it. I also know that the C40, which is the organisation of the biggest cities in the world, has done very important dialogues, etc., involving Chinese cities. Some American people are unfortunately trying to conceal all this and not do it. China's not engaged in diplomacy. China's engaged in an absolutely objective response, and I'm absolutely certain that people who are getting that help will welcome it.
NR, what do you think of the rationale behind those kind of thinking, that a helping hand from China has ulterior motives behind it?
Well, I mean, this is not a rational response. It really is very much political. You have Donald Trump, who wasted, in essence, 3 months doing nothing. And now he's in a situation where he's running for re-election, and he has to blame somebody. He can't say, look, I'm sorry, I was incompetent, I didn't prepare, I didn't do what I should do. It's not Donald Trump's style. He will go forward and he will double down and he'll say it's somebody else's fault. If you recall his campaign rhetoric and the rhetoric since he's been elected, America is always a victim of everybody else. So at this point, he's pushing that narrative. And unfortunately, it's costing people. I mean, look at the Asians who are being discriminated against in the U.S. 20% of doctors in the U.S. are Asian. 11% of the physician's assistants, Asian. 9% of all the nurses, Asian. I mean, and they're being attacked for trying to help. Some of the leading researchers in the world, Asians, who are trying to come up with a solution to COVID-19. And they're being vilified and attacked, just as is China. It's become a racial issue simply because of politics.
And Professor Bai, what do you think China and the Chinese should do when those goodwill gestures and admirable acts fall flat in some places?
I think I can understand the suspicion from other countries about China's motives. So in terms of the earlier question you raised about new global order, I think there is a fundamental dilemma of globalization. Globalization means going beyond states, but globalization now is led by nation states, and nation states by definition are doing everything for their own self-interest. So I think there is a fundamental problem. I think after the pandemic is over, globalization will continue on. But if we don't solve this fundamental conflict, effort that goes beyond the states is led by the states themselves. Things like this will come back again. So I think for China and for other countries, we need to search for a new language about how to protect our interests at the same time serving the humanity in general. So in my own book, a recent book by Princeton University Press called Against Political Equality, The Confucian Case, I try to argue that the Confucian ideal, a Tianxia system, might be a better model for global order than the present global order we have today.
But the problem is the politicians' finger-pointing have fomented negative sentiment in the people. Ambassador Cui's recent article also said, here is the quote, at a time when solidarity is essential, we need to keep cool heads and clearly say no to the folly of fanning racism and xenophobia and scapegoating other countries or races. Such acrimony will not only undercut cooperation between nations, but also sow seeds of suspicion and confrontation that could put our peoples and even the world in grave danger from this runaway virus and the economic fallout. So, NR, it seems this is already happening. Some Americans are blaming the Chinese for this virus, and also some Chinese are blaming Americans for spreading the virus from their place. How will this kind of a messaging affect the relationship between the two major powers in the world?
Well, it's going to have long-term effects. The Chinese are not going to forget this. Americans in their subconscious won't forget this. But let's make something very clear. China is doing the right thing. You're defined by your actions. And so if China continues to do the right thing, it will be held blameless in terms of history. What other people think and say, you cannot affect. You can only affect what your own actions are. In terms of going forward, yes, it is going to be very, very difficult. But in the cold light of day, when people start comparing what their governments did and accomplished with what China was able to do and accomplish, I think it'll be very clear what the situation is.
Yeah, you're very correct. I want to pin you down on this because it seems different countries reacted differently to the COVID-19. In a recent seminar hosted by Brookings Institution, it talked about experiences and lessons from those Asian countries, including China, South Korea, and Singapore. In a broader sense, is there a trend of influence from the East to the West in how to tackle a public health crisis like this?
Well, a part of it is traceable back to the fact that the countries that are doing the most and the best in terms of responding to this were all affected by SARS back in 2003. They have experience. They understand the gravity of the situation. That only involved a little over 8,000 people being affected. But it was taken seriously, and those lessons were taken to heart. Unfortunately, in the West, this same kind of experience has not resonated. What happened is you had governments cutting budgets. The reasons they don't have enough respirators working is because they literally cut the maintenance budgets. So these things are not able to continue. So, this is what happens in a system that's run politically in order to kind of justify itself as opposed to a system which is trying to justify itself based on its ability to govern.
And Professor Bai, I want to talk a little bit about your book. In your book, Against Political Equality, so you basically argue that in order to advance, countries shouldn't rely so much on equality to make people happy, but a Confucian-based meritocratic system. So you are saying that we cannot give people equal say in this public health crisis. Can you explain on that?
Right. So for Confucians, government exists to serve the people, and whether people are happy or not has to be decided by the people themselves. But what policies can make their lives prosperous? I think that's for Confucians beyond people's understanding. I think going back to problems mentioned, when a government is solely held accountable to the people, but people don't necessarily have a foresight about what's going to happen, then you can predict that a purely democratic country will do things that are good for the short term, but not necessarily good for the long term. So from the very beginning of this epidemic, the Western countries said this was because of China's failure to have open information and things like that. I think clearly we have some problems. We should rely more on experts. We should have more open channel of information. But the West, their response is just as bad. So far, actually for now, much worse. And I think that shows a simple, really a simple truth about politics. Rule of law and liberties don't give you effective government. And so ideally, we want to have a government that allows people to express their opinions, to have a rule of law, but at the same time to be effective. I think the question for me, a political theorist, is whether we could combine these two things, these two good things together, rule of law and protection of liberties on the one hand, and more effective government. And for the latter to happen, I think we should give more power to experts through political institutions. But experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci in the U.S. or Zhang Wenhong in China. They should have more power in the political decision-making process. And I think the way Western media portray this as the China model versus Western model, I think that's a fundamental mistake. We should not understand this as a conflict between two models, rather as a call for some kind of mixture, a hybrid of good things from both sides.
We can learn from each other in many ways. One important thing that China and the U.S. can do together is in the medical research field. John, a lot of people are hoping that China and the U.S. should lead international efforts in research into treatments and vaccines, and that will be more efficient and give a timely response to what we have seen. Do you think it is possible? Will government and businesses be willing to cooperate across the Pacific to come up with a better plan quicker?
Well, I think it has to be not in research, not only China and the US, but every country. You cannot tell in the question of scientific breakthroughs where it's going to come from. There are highly specialized and skilled people in the United States and China, but they're also in South Korea, they're in Japan, they're in Germany, they're in my own country. We don't know where the medical breakthroughs are going to come on this. What is absolutely certain is that every single country has to cooperate, but once we know that there is a key medical or scientific breakthrough, that every country spreads it as rapidly as possible without any thought of national self-interest. This is much too serious for any country to be trying to take advantage of by itself.
Another very thorny issue is what is the role of technology? Because the pandemic obviously exposed the inability of some countries to contain and keep control of the movement of people. And in order to keep track of people, you need data, and that means you have to use the technologies in monitoring and tracing those people. And where's the line of privacy protection and public health monitoring? What is your thinking on this?
I think most people don't care. They want to stay alive. Therefore, whatever is necessary to take to trace people, to prevent the contact tracing in such an emergency has to be taken. Later, when we have returned to something more approaching normalcy, we can discuss questions about privacy. But my view is 90% of the world's population just wants to be safe in this situation.
Einar, do you think people don't care in the U.S.? Because obviously here in Asia, a lot of people are willing to give away some of their freedom or their data in order the public health authorities can keep track of the virus.
You've hit on a very important issue. It's absolutely essential that you do not start saying that one system is better than another. That was the mistake of the people who believed in colonialism. They said, what we believe, others should also. I think it's necessary to understand, as our other colleagues said, that you have to learn from each other, try to select things that work. I do not believe that one solution fits all problems. So in this particular case, yes, Americans are much more things. Not all. I would agree with John, 90% just want to live, but you have 10% who are absolutely adamantly glued to their guns. They do the opposite of whatever the government does. They believe that no one is to be trusted, and that the only way that they'll survive is if they have enough toilet paper.
But still, it comes back to the political atmosphere. Do you think those countries in North America and Europe can stomach even the thinking that maybe we're not that exceptional, we can learn from other models and systems if they have something we really should reflect on?
No, I mean there's a very strong bias. You see this in terms of Huawei. I mean, stepping outside the COVID-19. There's this European and American belief that no Chinese, just like no Hispanic or African American or somebody other than white, can come up with something that's advanced, that works better than something that can be developed in Europe or America. And that's innate. I'm not saying that this is conscious. It's just part of the system, this belief that white colonialism has created the world, and that's the way it is, and that American exceptionalism should rule it. It's an unfortunate part. Hopefully we can get beyond it.
And Professor Bai, so it requires a lot of deep thinking and also public messaging for people to understand that different systems have its own merits and shortages.
Yeah, I think that's very important. But I think people can probably see alternative if their own system keeps encountering problem. We Chinese thought we were the only civilized people in the world for many, many years, and it's hard really to change that mindset. And so we were the leading power in the known world, which now we know is just East Asia, for hundreds, even thousands of years. And so it took many disastrous events for China to think otherwise. And the U.S. has led the world for 100 years or so, and it seems that it takes some time for them to think that maybe our way is not the only way, our way is not the best way, and they can listen. I think the Europeans are more open-minded than Americans because they, in a way, lost the world #1 status for some time, so they're willing to listen to others. Their system, the EU, encounters its own problem. They want to solve the nation-state problem through this EU structure, but now we see when real issue comes, this kind of soft power wouldn't be sufficient. So we need to have a stronger political global institution that could enforce measures and promote technologies.
I'd like to have more time to talk about the European Union issue, but we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Bai. Thank you, John, and thank you, NR. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.